All right, we're gonna go ahead and get started and call the meeting to order at 4 o'clock here. Roll call, at-large Cummins.
Here.
At-large Postian.
Here.
Ward 1 Welker.
Here.
Ward 2 Helm.
Here.
Ward 3 Johnston.
Here.
I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, next is approval of the agenda. Any additions, changes, comments? If not, a motion to approve the agenda.
Motion. Second.
Who seconded that?
Mayor.
George, okay. Motion by Helm, seconded by Welker.
Cummins?
Yes.
Postian?
Yes.
Welker?
Yes.
Helm?
Yes.
Johnston?
Yes.
Okay, communications. There is no scheduled communications and there's nobody from the public here, so we will move on from that to consent agenda. There's one item under consent agenda, and that's approval of the Tipton Revitalization Incentive Program request for Tipton Investment Partners for the CDS building located at 411 East South Street.
Motion.
Motion by Welker, seconded by Postian.
Postian?
Yes.
Welker?
Yes.
Helm?
Yes.
Johnston?
Yes.
Cummins?
Okay, then on to city business. One item is discussion and possible action concerning the fiscal year 2025-2026 budget, including choosing between option 1 and option 2. Melissa?
All right. Tonight, we're gonna start by discussing just some general budget items. We'll move into the 2 budget options, and then we'll finish with departments whose budgets increased by more than 5%. I'm talking and explaining what that was caused from. So the city's current tax rate is 16.365. The proposed budget tax rate is 15.593, which is a decrease of 77 cents. You may recall last year at our budget workshop, we talked about one of the major goals for the legislation was to reduce property taxes for residents. So that is working according to their legislation. Another one of their goals, though, was to bring cities under the 810 levy. So the current budget is the first year that was implemented. One of the ways that legislation is doing that is by doing the ratchet down approach. So whatever your taxable growth was, they have certain categories that you would fall in, and you would reduce by 3%, 2%, 1% of that taxable growth. So our taxable growth for FY 25-26 budget was 6.93%, which meant we fell into the 3% reduction category. We did bring in an additional $40,005 of new revenue into the general fund, but that ratchet down approach brought our consolidated general fund levy below the 810 levy. So our general fund levy is 7.88952. And so I calculated to see what the difference was if we were at that 810 levy, which we typically, before that legislation was put into place, we always were maxed at that 810 levy, and what that difference was. And that was a difference of $29,013. So essentially we were losing that $29,000. And if you remember from last year too, that legislation removed some levies that we use as well as some that we don't. One of those was the emergency levy. So we've lost that funding, and then essentially we're losing some more funding into the general fund. So those are property tax dollars that we're losing in there, but our general fund expenses aren't getting smaller. Operating costs are continuing to increase. So we're having to find different ways to kind of cover those, fund those, or reduce those. So with that in mind, I think we can go to the 2 budget options that were included in your packet. And I'll kind of highlight those options, and then we can kind of discuss them further. So both budget options have the same general fund deficit, which is the $320,903. The difference between the 2 options is the payroll percentage potential increase between those. And I'll go more into it in the budget option 2 of what that flexibility is. But for budget option 1, there's a 2.42% wage increase unless it was otherwise approved within the Hinson study. So that 2.42 was calculated based off the cost of living that was within the Hinson approved scale. So we have a 320,000 deficit. So we had to look for what are some things we can cut? Where can we find additional revenue to come in and help cover those things? And so we've listed some items that we came up with. So the first thing was CIPs. As you'll remember, the general fund and all departments have CIPs, and the goal with those are to plan for future projects. But right now, they're just not working for the general fund specifically because we don't have the time to be able to cover those. So all CIP items were cut from the general fund unless they were either saved for already, approved by budget already, approved by council already, or life saving, such as turnout gear for the fire department. Everything else was zeroed out for this year. That doesn't mean that they've been removed from the CIPs for those departments, though. It's just for this year, they've been zeroed out. And we're gonna need to take a harder look at how to keep those in the general fund in the future and find a different approach to it. And maybe we need to think about what are qualifying items to put on a CIP, and then what are things that we're gonna have to find other ways to fund, like with a bond or other sources. So we're really gonna have to kind of look at those, and we've had that discussion with department heads, but for now, we did those reductions, and that reduced $86,792. So the other thing that we did is I asked for department heads to kind of go through their budgets and scrub some things, and they were able to come up with some reductions in their budgets. And then I went through and also removed anything that wasn't close to what was actually spent in years prior. So that came up with an additional $64,000 of reduction within the general fund. And then another thing that we did to increase revenue into the general fund was through pilots. So the pilots are the payment in lieu of taxes. Those come from the enterprise funds. In years past, we've kept those to 6.75%, but unfortunately, we're looking to increase those to 8% this year. And that does impact those enterprise funds, because then that's an expense in their budget. So then that takes away from them spending that on other things within their budget. So it definitely has a full circle effect for everyone. And then the last thing that we did for that budget option one was it increased loss into the general fund. So typically we only increase a certain amount into the general fund, but we're doing an additional amount, which in years past we've helped save that in loss to help pay for aquatic center or grants that come in and use that as a match for things. So this would be additional funding in there. And one thing that I didn't mention for the budget option one is, in addition to the Hinton study, it also included moving a part-time position to full-time with a pay increase above the 2.42%, and then an additional 4% for the library director's salary for the recommendation of the library board. So that's all encompassing in that budget option one. Are there any questions about that before I go to budget option two? Or do you want to hear budget option two? And then we can kind of bounce back. Okay. So budget option two, essentially same general fund deficit. It is the same CIP reductions, the same pilots, the same lost amount. Where there's some flexibility is within the wage increase. So the first option had the 2.42% listed. But then that table below has the percentages listed out. If we would reduce the payroll increase, then you're going to take that savings and you can put that towards the operating costs. So your operating costs, instead of having a reduction of 64,000, it could be 53,493 if you would choose the 2% option. So there's a little bit more flexibility in there. It can be anything within there. It could be a number that's not on there. What this budget option, though, does include is it would move the part-time to full-time position at the library, but the wages for that position and the library director would be level across the board like everyone else. So the recommendations by the library board is not in this budget option too. So with that, what questions do you have? Or thoughts?
When was the last pay increase?
Last year.
Last year.
That's the Hinton week. It was a big one.
Last year was the one, we had Hinton come back in and did the study and the reevaluation.
Was that,
So
it was within the year though, right?
it was like
Within this year?
this year currently, it
Yep.
went into effect July 1, yes. And it was a wide range of
Mhm.
increases. It wasn't a certain percentage across the board for everyone.
The library did not get a part of that, just,
The library did get an increase. You got an increase. You
yes,
didn't get the.
yes, and not the Henson like everybody
But you
else.
got an increase.
Yes,
For your library.
yes, but I was not part of the Henson.
Melissa, I'm sorry to interrupt you. The 2%
Yep.
how much of that is just to cover inflation?
That is the cost of living increase. Yeah.
Well, if you think about last year, we had back then an option 1 and an option 2. One of them was to increase funding for pay. The other one was to stay, lower on pay, but it could have funded more internal projects. The council opted for an increase in pay, which I think was generally 5%, except for certain ones that had more of a focus. And at the time, I remember the council said, maybe not all of you, but at least some of you said, that if you took that option last year and things didn't turn out so well this year, it may not be followed in the same way. It may go the other way depending on how the budget looked. So when the finance committee looked at this, and I'll let them speak on their own behalf, but just maybe to lead into that, I think they were looking at, if looking at option 2, they were looking at the trade-off that she shows in that chart. So if you were somewhere around, say, 1.5% as an example, the savings from the payroll side would be around 18,000 and 45,000 reduction on the general fund expense side. So in that chart, they're trying to look for a balance. They talked about the possibility of a wage freeze, but that was looked at, I think, as a much lower priority choice. They didn't want to go that far, but I think there was some apprehension about going the full 2.42, even though that's the current inflation rate, because they were looking for that balance between payroll and general fund expenses. But I guess I'll let anybody from the committee expand on that if they'd like to.
Well, I'll just second what Brian said. Just sort of based on our discussions is, nobody likes to freeze people's pay, right, and give you absolutely nothing. Having worked in government my entire life, we know that that's a possibility, and that has happened many times in my 30+ year career, that I haven't gotten pay increases because, budgets aren't where they need to be. So I think there's probably, for any of those of you who have worked, in any type of government at any given time, there's probably that possibility that has occurred to you as well. And while it's not ideal, I think when we had the discussion about budgets last year and going with option 1, I think we had council members who said, if we do this, there's no guarantees for next year. And the department heads seemed to understand and be okay with that. So I think that's, something worth considering. And so when we had our finance committee meeting, we had the discussion with Melissa and asked her to sort of put this chart together for us to see how it would impact the budget if we were to give something, but maybe not, what is ideal or necessarily what people want. I guess, Abby, Luke, do you have anything to add to that? So that's where we're at this point.
No, I think you guys covered what we discussed. So.
Yeah, I do remember that now that we chose that option for the increase.
Yep.
Not knowing what was going to happen.
Knowing that it wasn't a year ago, that it maybe wasn't the best option for the general fund, across the board. but trying to do, and be fair to the employees, based on the Hinson study. So I think that's something that the council has to consider at this point, that, I've supervised people my entire career, and I hate to tell people they can't have raises, but stranger things have happened, right?
And the thing about the overall picture of these negative numbers, the 86, the 104, the 65,000, in the CIP, the moves that were made fix this coming budget year. They don't fix the out years. The out years were left the same as what the current budget would have been. It just fixes the upcoming year. Everything going out is the same. Well, before the legislation happened to try to cut cities and counties back, the CIP worked. But the more we get cut back by and limited by the state legislature, the more our CIP is going to get skinny down to the very core of what we're looking at. And the other part is, we only started the CIP about 7 or 8 years ago. Well, when you do that, you front load a lot of it because you don't have the time to build things up. So we're probably going to have to lengthen out the lifetime of equipment we have now. We're probably going to have to concentrate on new equipment that have timelines that are out in the future, so that what we're putting aside every year is less. Or, like Melissa said, if we're looking for something that's more upfront in time, we're probably going to have to take out debt for it, where maybe we wouldn't now. And right now, the debt levy is one of those things that isn't limited yet. So in a way, unless the legislature looks at the debt levy, the legislature is basically forcing cities to look at debt where we wouldn't have looked at it before. The other thing I guess I wanted to point out was the pilot, the payment in lieu of taxes, and that's basically relying heavily on electric, and then after that, the natural gas utility.
And water and stuff.
Yeah. But heavily on the electric side. But when you look at that 104,000, 105,000, if we didn't have that, where would we be in this budget? We're fortunate that we have our major utilities like we do. A lot of cities don't have that. And I don't know if at some point the legislature's gonna look at pilots like this. But for right now, that helps the general fund budget. It doesn't help the budgets of those utilities, and we might have to look at how those are structured as far as their budgets go. But this is something that if we stay on the trend we're on, it's going to make next year look even tougher than this year.
A question now, how close are we in relationship to everybody else on the Hinson as far as wages go right now?
As far as
The wages for
other cities?
Yes.
Well, we wanted to be competitive, and I think in some cases we are somewhat above the curve on what we've done.
I know we took a pretty good increase there back in July.
Yeah.
That's not necessarily the case for the library director. It's not the case for the library director.
You mean not getting the Hinson study pay increase? Is that?
Not necessarily that, just he asked how is her.
Oh, how you
pay
compare it to other.
And
Okay.
it's, we actually have some information about that if anybody would be interested in looking at it.
Was the library director not on the Hinton
Library
budget, or-
director was on there. Their
What
board
did they-
chose a different route last year and chose a different percentage rather than the one that
I
Hinton.
couldn't remember.
So it was a board decision.
I've also got an email from Melissa saying that that they, it says, with that being said, if the board does not want to make the full adjustment initially, they could also look at a phased approach. Another thing to consider is how the increase in wages will impact the library operating budget expenses. We haven't seen the full-scale wage recommendation yet from Mr. Henson, but one thing we have stressed to department heads is that increasing wages will have to result in a decrease in another area, most likely the operating expense side. All department heads will be asked to help solve that problem so that we can eventually get to a balanced budget. And Amanda writes back then, who is the board president, okay, so that is where my curiosity lies. Because of the lack of increase last year, isn't it just as easy to prepare the additional budgets to include the 4% that should have been given with the large increase last year? The general feeling is, had we known that the plan discussed wouldn't be honored, we would have done a larger lump sum increase when everyone else received it. And that is a quote. I can show you the email.
So I think I wrote the email. So my explanation of that email was that was not guaranteeing any wage increase for anyone. But also, I think the thing that is impacting the library budget this year is they're moving a part-time position to a full-time, in addition to the 2 full-time positions they have now. So in addition to having that full-time wage increase for that position, there's also vacation, sick pay, FICA, IPERS, there's life insurance, there's not city insurance that position is taking, but there's other costs associated with moving that part-time to full-time besides just the library director increase. So there's multiple increases in that budget that is also causing the issue.
And the thing is, I mean, if we want to talk about it, geez. Library boards are governmentally autonomous, but they're not financially autonomous. So if they take somebody and make them from part-time to full-time, they can make that decision. But that decision carries forward to you to cover it. And you're not necessarily consulted when they decide that. And I don't think you were in this case, right?
You mean the council?
Yeah,
No, sir, they were not. They don't have to be.
but if you want them to cover that expense, isn't it a good idea to bring them into the picture?
I was preparing the budget ahead of time so that we could put the money in here. And I also have, we might as well throw names out here. Becky is the one that's going to be moved to assistant director. She's doing everything right now as an assistant director and getting paid nothing. I mean, across the board on this table that we have. She was making more over at West Branch than she will make with her pay raise this year, or this next fiscal year.
I don't think anyone's taking away from
Well,
what
I'm
Becky
just
does,
saying.
Becky's duties. And I agree,
Yeah,
we've done fabulous things at the library. I think the problem we're trying to solve is, so there was a significant payroll increase in your budget that no one was consulted about, and we're trying to cover, in addition to, I mean, you heard there's huge expenses within all general fund budgets. So it's it's across the board. We're trying to figure it out for everyone. So it's across the board.
But in your budget too, it works in the full-time.
It works in the full-time position. Yep, with the same percentage for everyone, whatever the council would decide. I felt like I had to give an option that had max savings. Option 1 has what the cost of living is with the board's recommendation, but I felt like I needed to show another option that was max savings, since we are trying to take from everything.
Yeah. Now, if you want to do
Both
something-
options have full-time for the library,
Yes.
correct? Okay.
Yeah, if you want to do something different than what the options are here, you have that prerogative.
I'm just gonna throw this out there. I work in the private sector. I haven't had a raise in 5 years. Well, I mean, Abby, you know how I feel. Like,
I'm with you.
and we kind of said this when we I was worried about it when we did that raise. I think I was the one that said,
We vocalized it last year.
yeah, like if we do this, it's gonna cause pain.
We did.
We knew it.
And I think we asked people in the.
We did.
We asked which way they wanted to go, we gave them the option. If I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just saying, like, I feel like sometimes people think it's guaranteed you're gonna get a pay raise, cost of living pay raise. I worked more hours than I did 5 years ago, and I ain't making any more money. Truth hurts, it sucks, but that's the time we're in right now. And I'm looking at this going, if this is my budget at home, and I'm 300 some thousand in debt, 320,093, I gotta cut a lot of stuff. And that's what we gotta do. I don't wanna continue this. Say I don't get elected in 2 years or whatever, I don't want the next guy to have to deal with this either. I would rather have one bad year, everybody can be mad at me, whatever. And then hopefully next year, we get some things figured out, but you guys speak for yourselves, but that's how I handle my budget. I don't know about anybody else.
Just a couple of things. Option one with 2.42. One thing, there was good reason for the increases that we battled for last year, and it was to retain employees because we were starting to see a trend of losing people. And so I hate to undo something that was so too pulling difficult to get to. We finally got to it. Thank you for that. I think it was for the best of everybody. On the other hand, yeah, it's a financial burden. Sometime we may have to consider that Tipton is offering more services than it can afford. Okay, some essential, some not. Okay. Everybody sat here through a very, very tense meeting with the public over the aquatic center and the pool and the future of it. And they really didn't even want us to talk about it. They wouldn't let us bring ideas. Here we are fighting to do this budget. None of those people are sitting here tonight.
Mm-hmm.
Because they don't think about that end of it. But here we are, we got to deal with it. On CIP, Melissa and I had this conversation. I am supposed to, if I'm doing my job, I'm supposed to project, for instance, when are my pumps going to fail at the West Lagoon in the lift station? So that goes on the CIP. It's called pump replacement, whatever. So I have to project that. But if they're not failing, I'm not replacing them. So CIP can flex fairly easily. But then again, sometimes you get a surprise the other way, like we did, say, the manhole at 8th and Orange. That one got bumped up and wasn't funded. So a lot of the CIP stuff is projections that can get extended. So for that reason, option one looks pretty good to me. Most of my stuff is running pretty smooth in water and sewer, and those CIPs can probably freeze and continue. I do have one question. And I think probably most everybody is curious. AMI has been pushed back already, mainly because we're waiting for supply and demand. We can't get the stuff. We've approved it years ago with you guys, saved money for years. It's in the CIPs across 3, 4 different budgets. We haven't been able to get the stuff. So it's been frozen. What if Dan Ashworth says, hey, I can get it now? You think we'll do it, or do you picture that?
25, 26.
You picture that being froze too for a year or no?
I left it in there. It's in
That's
25,
in there.
26.
So we are gonna fund that.
Mhm.
Makes sense. I didn't know the answer to that. I was just curious. So that's my little take. So should be interesting in the paper.
Thanks, Brian.
I have one question. Now, this all went in effect as far as the last raise was back in July, correct?
Yes.
What if is there any way to do this budget and have it looked at again in June, as far as perhaps give the 2.4 if everything comes together with our CIP?
I would have to do a budget amendment. So the budget that will go into effect
That would
next
be almost
July
a year
has to be
from,
certified.
a year from a raise, what I'm trying to say.
Right, so I have to certify this budget though by April 30th for next July. So that's where I kind of need to know And we can always change it. We can always go back and do a budget amendment, but we levy for FICA and IFRS, which is based off of payroll, and you can't
Okay.
change that for the general fund. So that helps bring in that additional revenue.
I'm just throwing it out there.
Brian, was there any recommendation from the finance committee?
No,
What
I
they thought
don't.
we should do, or what?
Well, I think they mostly looked at this option too, but I don't think they picked a combination of, what percent of increase in pay versus reduction in expense in the general fund. I think they wanted to try to be something above 0%, but they didn't really pick a number that I recall.
No, we asked Melissa basically to do this chart so that we could compare and see what, at different levels of pay increases and how that affected the budget. And so that's where we're at. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think that's what we discussed, right?
I mean, most needed time to get the numbers together.
Yeah, I think, I don't want to speak for Abby or Luke, but I think, the primary discussion we had is, well, we hate to not give any raises at all, but whether we can really do the 2.4 to whatever percent seems unrealistic. And so is there a compromise that the council would entertain, I guess?
If we went like the 1.5, we'd save $18,000, correct?
And that could be applied towards operating expenses.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking at too.
What would you think?
1.5.
I know what I think, but y'all don't like that.
Well, we don't know what you think. What do you think?
When it hits the fan, you duck like a turtle. We're spending money.
I went, yeah. I agree. I hate to see it not getting nothing, but.
Well, when you run your own business, you don't spend money if you don't have it. It's simple.
That's correct. However, and we're in a different situation, I get that, but like Jason said, I haven't seen a raise for, I don't know how long. That said, all of my employees have had a raise every year. It's not always what they want, and it's not always a certain percentage, and I usually take the hit. In fact, I've lowered my wage before in order to give raises, but we can't do that here. That's not a position that we have. But you put yourself in that hardship because your employees are doing a job for you. So
I don't even feel the 1.5 would cover.
you can't not give them anything.
Cover what?
Cost the base.
So last year when you guys were talking budget, and you did say straight up, if we go with this option that was picked, that means next year's not guaranteed.
We did say
And
that.
every department agreed on that. That's mine included. And I have talked to my staff and said, everything's tight. You're seeing it in the paper. You're hearing it from everywhere else. They get that. They totally understand that there might not be a raise. One of the really important things for us last year was we wanted to be
Comparable.
treated just like every employee, not singled out. So coming from that side of it, everybody was asked if they were okay with, okay, this is what we're doing this year, and next year, we may not have the money for any raises. And everybody said that was fine. So that still stands for our department. Because I have talked to them at our staff meeting last month. They know I'm at this meeting tonight. They know what's up.
Thank you.
Brian, what's your input? You talk to your people?
Talking to me?
Mhm.
Oh,
There's only two options.
they did, in Public Works, they talked about it. Yeah, I don't know that they fully understood the weight of it or the details of it, but they did. They did have a discussion about it down there that Steve brought to them. So they're not my guys, really. We
Yeah.
work back and forth a lot, but,
Steve's not here, so.
right. So I didn't catch a lot of feedback there, honestly. Like I said, I don't know that they fully grasped what was going on. So,
I don't think that that's unusual. I think most people probably don't fully grasp it. I think that
there's a lot to.
until it happens, you don't really kind of believe it. But I feel something has to be given.
I agree.
And unfortunately, unless we give option one, nobody's gonna be happy. But
What's that?
I said, I feel like something needs to be given, but it's, unfortunately, at least it's sounding like that unless we do budget one, we're not making people happy, but I don't think,
Well, if we do option two.
you gotta do what you gotta
The
do.
1.5.
Well, I think we all should be happy that we have a job.
True.
We did take a big chunk of money and spend that back there when we did the instance, so I mean, I don't, like I was saying, the price of eggs right now, that 1.5 won't even cover that. So,
Melissa, on this option two situation, I haven't done the math on it, but
Huh?
if we're still 320 short, you add all that up, that's 240 and change, 240 something. I'm assuming we gotta come up with another,
No, you still have the 86,000, the 104, the 65, and then the combined of these two options is
Okay.
the 64,000.
okay,
So
so
that
basically, if we
totals
don't get to
the
64,000,
So the 64,000 is kind of where there's the flexibility to decide if you would lower the percentage of the pay increase, that excess then can go into the operating expenses, so you don't have 64,000 to reduce in operating expenses, you have 25,000 or whatever,
Right.
whatever the percentage is. So it just bumps it a little bit.
so pretty much any of these numbers would work.
Yeah.
Okay.
myself, I'd say option two with the 1.5. That's where I'm sitting at.
Does that balance it? No?
Yeah.
Have a-
All those would balance it.
You say it's $65 a month. That breaks down to $65 a month for an employee.
That's just average, like.
Yeah. Average for that.
What's everyone else think? And essentially, I think I need a motion.
And I was just waiting to, Abby's shaking her head, so I was like, is she gonna say something, or is she thinking, or what is she?
Why don't you take, just, what's your temperature? What are you thinking? Abby, what are you thinking? We won't hurt you.
Even though you wore a Green Bay hat, it coat in.
Oh my gosh, are you kidding me?
Saw that, wore a Green Bay hat.
That's horrible.
I know.
I don't know.
Luke?
I wouldn't go more than 1.5.
I don't know, I struggle. Maybe I'm the only person at this table who is also paid by the government, but I feel the struggle here. I think we all know this, but I mean, I know the importance of the people that we have and making sure we continue to keep the people we have. I also, though, understand the financials of it, and I mean, I think option two is where we have to land. I'm just struggling really hard with the percentages.
Yeah.
I have a hard time struggling with, I mean, I know what it's like to make under the allowable growth for living. Like it's tricky, internal confliction.
And I haven't seen, and I won't probably until July 1st, what the state pay increases are, but typically it's 1.5% as a state employee. So, I mean, that's all I've done from the state side of my job for years. So I think come July 1st, if people are going to compare, I think that's a reasonable comparison to say, well, you know, state government, local government, federal government, doesn't, you know, we all have budget issues, right? And so I think that's maybe a good comparison to tell people that, you know, what we're giving is likely what the state's going to give to state employees. I don't know that for sure, but most of us don't know until the first of the fiscal year. But that's typically what's budgeted for state employees.
You guys would be put into a tough spot where your hand's being forced. And I think everybody reads that, but if you could give them the huge pay raise, you would.
Right.
And you just can't. I mean, I hate to be quoted as the guy saying slow it down too, but I also think about next year. If you don't consider the lower option, you're going to be in a real predicament, most likely. And the one thing I think we should be celebrating is not once you brought up the concept of cutting people or cutting departments. I'm just really fearful that if we don't be conservative, that you'll be at that conversation sooner or later. It's really the buffer that is being established. You're only one upseas away from being out of budget. If you go too high, I think that we're there.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Brian.
I'll make a motion, option 2 with 1.25.
Second,
With the 1.25,
Yeah,
okay.
1.25.
fill that in.
Okay, so
Oh, it's already
motion,
there.
by Helm for budget option 2 with a 1.25% pay increase.
Can we clarify, because the whole time you talked about 1.5, did you mean 1.25?
Yes.
Okay.
They were having a sidebar
I think
conversation
they-
over
yeah.
here, I
We're trying to
think.
get it going here.
Okay. Is there a second to that motion?
I did.
Oh, you did, sorry. Okay, so motion by Helm, seconded by Walker.
Welker,
Yes.
Helm,
Yes.
Johnston,
No.
Cummins,
Yes.
Postian,
Yes.
That's everyone, right? Okay. Sorry, obviously I was like, is that everyone? Okay, all right. Motion carried then. Okay, so then moving on to the next agenda item, which is reports from mayor, council, department heads. Okay, bye, thank you.
If I need to come back, I'll swing back by.
Thanks, Jason. Department heads, anything else from anyone? Okay. Council? Melissa? Brian? No, I have nothing either. So, motion to adjourn? Motion by Helm, seconded by Walker.
Helm,
Yes.
Johnston, Cummins,
Yes.
Welker.
Yes.
Okay, meeting adjourned.